This is Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for being here. I'm greatly concerned about the safety of Israel and for the safety of Jewish Americans. The responses we've seen around the country to the October 7th attacks, especially at some of our colleges and universities, to me is a problem, especially our public institutions. I'm a great supporter of the exercise of the First Amendment, and I believe it is critical for the American way of life. But people must be allowed to speak freely and assemble peacefully. But when that speech is in favor of terrorists, we must look at the underlying issues. Why did students rally in support for Hamas, a group that viciously attacked innocent people, beheaded and burned children, and raped young girls? This is because our younger generations are not taught everything that the greatest generation learned through war. Evil is evil, and it must be stopped. The fact that these rallies for Hamas were even allowed is beyond troubling. Allowing these protests isn't educational progress. This is progressivism at its worst. Students and others that rallied in support of the actions on October 7th have proven their lack of historical knowledge. 80 years ago, this country went to war with the Axis powers that sought to destroy any way of life that they felt was inferior to their own. My family knows these people well. I lost an uncle to the Nazis, and my daddy fought the Japanese in the Pacific. And then he went on to China and fought the communists there for a short while. This is the type of enemy we promised the world we would never allow again. I support the efforts of Israel to rid the world of a group that is hell-bent on murdering Jews. Our attention to this tragedy must be twofold. We must support Israel in this fight, and we must educate our young people that evil is evil and must be dealt with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. As you have heard all of us say, but I'll say it for the record myself, on October 7th, we all watched in horror as Hamas terrorists murdered, tortured, raped, and kidnapped over 1,400 Israelis. 32 Americans were also killed in that attack. This grotesque assault on our closest ally in the region deserves universal condemnation from every member in this body. The U.S., the UN, and much of the international community have designated Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization. Their stated goal is the destruction and decimation of all Israeli people. Their actions have also demonstrated their indifference towards the safety of Palestinian people. There is absolutely no room for sympathy or equivocation when it comes to Hamas, and about that we should be absolutely clear. I join my colleagues in applauding President Biden for his stalwart support of Israel during this time, and I commend Secretary Blinken for his masterclass in shuttle diplomacy to shore up the U.S. bilateral relationships with our regional partners and to lay the groundwork for intensive diplomatic efforts to achieve sustainable peace. Words do matter, and what we talk about in this committee and in Congress also matters. That's why urging for an adherence to international law and the laws of war while ramping up humanitarian aid is so important. This assertion is not anti-Israeli. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has agreed to this in principle. I echo President Biden's calls for temporary localized pauses to allow for surges of humanitarian aid, but I remain opposed to a long-term durable ceasefire until all hostages are returned and certain commitments are made by Hamas. A premature ceasefire would give Hamas a reprieve and allow them to regroup, reorganize, and rearm. I also urge at the same time, though, the IDF to reconsider its tactics to ensure its counterterrorism campaign is proportionate. Again, these remarks should not be misconstrued as delegitimizing Israel's campaign to root out Hamas. We cannot accept the false choice that Republicans have been pushing on us when they say you either support Israel in its war effort or you support Hamas. Bolstering Israel's defense and urging the protection of innocent Palestinians are not mutually exclusive ideas. We can and we must do both. I'd like to ask my question, though, more specifically about Turkey. Ms. Stroll, Turkey consistently tops the list of U.S. arms importers and recipients of U.S. military aid because it's considered a strategic NATO ally. I believe Turkey's relationship with Hamas alone is enough to cease all arm exports to Ankara as Erdogan continues to express his sympathy for Hamas, not to mention the fact that Turkey has routinely acted as a spoiler within the NATO alliance. The Arms Export Control Act requires the U.S. government to conduct in-use monitoring of where these military exports go. I wonder if there have been any indications that Turkey's relationship with Hamas has resulted in the transfer of weapons of U.S. origin to Hamas by Turkey. And how is the U.S. government able to ascertain and deal with that?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. As part of any foreign military sale to any partner or ally, there is robust end-use monitoring for how those weapons are used. We have no indication that anything provided to Turkey has fallen into the hands of Hamas.
Well, that's reassuring. I would just ask you, too, how you are balancing the relationship with Qatar and Turkey in terms of their assistance with hopefully getting out some of the hostages and their having Hamas leadership within their boundaries, visiting.
Congresswoman, what I would say is the following. Qatar and Egypt, but especially Qatar, have been profoundly involved in the relentless quest to secure the release of hostages, foreign hostages, Israeli hostages, the whole lot. They've also been engaged in a very intensive effort to help with the help Ambassador Satterfield in his efforts to get humanitarian assistance in and foreign nationals out, something that has been impeded repeatedly by Hamas. Of course, the military leadership is well protected underground, far from the conflict above. The political leadership is the external piece through which the Qataris are working and the Egyptians as well.
Anyways, time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to my colleague on the other side of the aisle who is expressing this idea of proportionality with respect to Gaza, I think it's important that in this moment, in the face of this barbarism from Hamas terrorists, that we're careful not to use nuance too much. What we need right now is moral clarity, and nuance is not really apropos at the moment. As you said in response to my colleague, there is a lot of misinformation. Why an ambulance? Because it was full of Hamas terrorists and weapons. That's why an ambulance. Moral clarity requires that we call out terrorism for what it is. And when there are calls for a ceasefire that would only enable Hamas to reconstitute another attack, that's not appropriate either. So, Ms. Leaf, I do want to address Secretary Blinken's call for Israel to provide a humanitarian pause. We all support humanitarian assistance for the innocent, but those running Gaza do not care about humanitarian needs, as you know and as you've testified. Did Hamas prevent innocent Palestinians from fleeing Gaza City to safer locations further south in Gaza?
Absolutely.
And does this make it harder for those people to access aid?
Absolutely.
And Ms. Leaf, is Hamas actively hoarding resources to pursue its Islamic jihadist war against Israel instead of providing water, fuel, and food to those affected by war?
Yes, they are.
And Ms. Leaf, do you feel Hamas would use any pause in Israel's effort to root out terrorist cells and uncover Hamas's urban terrorist network to resupply its warfighters?
They would certainly attempt to, but that is something that I know that the Israeli government is actively considering.
So I hope that the Secretary and the President consider that when calling for a humanitarian pause. Did President Biden condition any support for Israel on the IDF engaging in a pause?
No, he did not.
Well, that's good to hear. Let me follow up on the line of questioning regarding our partner in Qatar. Of course, the Qataris have been very helpful with Al Udeid Air Base, and we appreciate that. But with respect to releasing hostages, how helpful have they been? Are they using their considerable leverage to seek the release of all hostages immediately?
They absolutely are. They've worked at it relentlessly. The problem is who they're talking to at the other end of the phone line. And it's a real question as to whether Yahya Sinwar is serious in any degree about releasing those hostages.
And is the Hamas office in Qatar seeing any pressure from the Qatari government?
Absolutely.
It's good to hear. I do think the Qataris are important partners for us, but we want to make sure that we emphasize to them how helpful they can be in this moment. They want to be kind of the Switzerland of the Middle East. They can be very, very helpful in this moment, and I appreciate us taking advantage of that relationship. Taylor Force Act, real quick, Ms. Leaf, with the war ongoing, how are we ensuring that any U.S. support to NGOs operating in Gaza are not violating the Taylor Force Act? Are we seeing any support for the families of Hamas terrorists killed during the invasion of Israel in exchange for their participation?
We are not seeing any of that, and we have asked the question and received the right assurances.
Is the administration reconsidering this idea of providing assistance to NGOs, supposedly pro-Palestinian NGOs, as a way of bypassing or circumventing the Taylor Force Act?
We do not bypass or circumvent the letter or the spirit of the Taylor Force Act.
I just think there ought to be some analysis of aid that may not go to the Palestinian Authority, but nevertheless goes to NGOs that could serve as a kind of proxy for martyr payments. And so I just want rigorous oversight from the State Department so that both the spirit and the letter of Taylor Force is complied with.
I can assure you of that, Congressman.
Finally, this issue of sanctions relief and the Financial Services Committee, we had a very important testimony about the $16 billion that was unfrozen, both in terms of the South Korea deal with the hostage deal and also the $10 billion held in Iraq to pay off Baghdad's debts for its purchase of Iranian natural gas. It's a lot of money that has been basically effectively sanctions relief delivered to Iran as a result of this administration's policies. Is the Biden administration reconsidering chasing sanctions relief with Iran in light of the events of October 7th?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the verb you use. Is the Biden administration changing?
Chasing sanctions relief with Iran. Has the administration reconsidered that course, that policy, given October 7th and the events that have occurred?
So the monies you referred to from South Korea that have been moved to different accounts that will be put through a rigorous metered process that will only be spent on humanitarian goods, food, and medicine and so forth, that is not altered. That was an arrangement set up by the previous administration, and we are rigorously applying the same restrictions to it. The money has not moved. The monies you referred to for natural...
I'm sorry. I'm just, in fairness to the witnesses and to the other members, I want to keep this on time.
My time has expired, but I think the line of questioning illustrates the point that maximum pressure was working and moving away was the wrong move. Thanks.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For both witnesses, are there any updates that either of you can provide in this unclassified setting regarding the status of the hostages?
I could not. I'd be happy to talk to you in a different setting.
Thank you. Same for you. Okay. Let me ask you this. Is the administration in continuous contact with the Israeli government about the status of the hostages, and can we be assured that the administration will provide whatever assistance may be helpful in that effort?
24/7, I can assure you. And yes, we are providing all support.
Thank you. Moving on, ever since these horrible attacks, which don't need to be further described because we all know exactly what we're talking about, happened on October 7th. I personally have felt devastated. So many Americans have, as well as people around the world. I felt that both as an American and a member of Congress, but also as a Jewish American. But that heartbreak has been amplified by horrific cases of both Palestinians and Jewish Americans being targeted here in the United States, including the unthinkable murder of Wadi al-Fayoum, the 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy in Chicago, as well as the death of a 69-year-old Jewish man, Paul Kessler, after he was injured during an altercation at a rally or competing rallies while he was peacefully waving an Israeli flag. And that obviously is of deep concern to all of us for the safety of Americans generally, for the safety of people with Palestinian or any kind of Arabic background, as well as people who are Jews. And my concern is that in this climate, rhetoric that equates everyday Palestinians, civilians, let's just call them civilians, to Hamas, including at times in this body, Congress, is not just morally unacceptable, but it's also tantamount to actively endangering the lives of our fellow Americans. And I will say that as a representative of a district that includes a vibrant Jewish community, as well as a vibrant Palestinian American community and other Arab American and Muslim communities, these issues are really personal to me and many of my constituents. So first let me ask whether both of you agree with the premise that Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And would you agree that the rhetoric that equates Palestinian civilians or Palestinian Americans with Hamas is rhetoric that actually strengthens Hamas and undermines Israel's security by feeding into their propaganda that Hamas is a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people?
We absolutely make a distinction. Hamas as a terrorist organization has perpetrated a brutal set of attacks. The Palestinian people don't deserve to be lumped in such a way, and so we absolutely distinguish in our discussion of that topic.
And did you want to add anything to that?
It is, I completely agree with Assistant Secretary Leaf. The Palestinians in Gaza deserve much better than Hamas, and it is critical from a Department of Defense perspective that military operations distinguish between targeting Hamas and protecting innocent Palestinian civilians.
Thank you. I want to turn to something else just because of the shortage of time. I'm very, very concerned about the humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians in Gaza. And we know that the only place where this is available is through the Rafah crossing, which seems to have alternating access and the availability of passing through. As of a couple of hours ago, according to an article that I just saw during this hearing, the crossing's been shut down due to some sort of security incident. Can you speak about ongoing efforts to increase the amount of aid and how to get it to the innocent civilians?
Ambassador Satterfield and his team, backstopped by here in Washington, but backstopped by our missions in Cairo and Jerusalem, is working relentlessly. The operating environment is so phenomenally complex, and the security conditions on the other side in Gaza are parlous, that it has been just an exhausting effort to keep that aperture open. But that is what we are focused on, and we are determined to steadily increase the number of trucks over this next period. It's now about anywhere from 70 to 100. We want to get it up to 300, 400, 500.
Joe Lady's time's expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for you, Secretary Leaf. Professor Alan Dershowitz recently talked about a Hamas strategy that he referred to as the CNN strategy, or what others have labeled the dead baby strategy. The basic concept is that Hamas attacks Israel in a manner that it knows will draw a military response. Then in a strategy that can only be described as barbaric and cowardly, Hamas retreats into its strongholds, as we've been discussing, and uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. Not that Hamas has any regard for the law of war, or are there any other rules for that matter, but engaging in disgusting acts such as this is a complete and utter violation of the law of armed conflict. Israel does its best, I think, to avoid civilian casualties, and in this conflict gave civilians time to depart from northern Gaza an act which Hamas reportedly attempted to block. And I heard earlier today that there was also things that just millions of flyers were dropped all over northern Gaza. They made thousands and thousands of phone calls to evacuate people before anything happened. So I think they're doing their best to avoid this. But eventually there are civilian casualties with this setup. Hamas then blames Israel as the guilty party, claiming that they are willingly killing innocent civilians. The success of this CNN strategy depends on the mainstream media, and unfortunately, perhaps members of Congress, as we recently heard here with the ambulance comment, which anyone who knew of the ambulance story certainly knew that it was filled with Hamas fighters, because every story I saw on every channel, they were grouped together. So anyways, but it relies on them buying into this narrative and allowing itself to be used as a tool of Hamas. So, Secretary Leaf, I was just wondering, what efforts, if any, is the administration undertaking to ensure that Hamas in their CNN strategy is ineffective? Specifically, what is the administration doing to push back on Hamas' false narrative and to show American people in the world that Israel has an inherent right to self-defense, that Israel's current operation is on solid legal footing, and that Hamas is the one that is violating the law of war in numerous ways? What are we doing to stop this spread of this misinformation?
Thank you, Congressman. You know, the point of Hamas's operations is terror. Full stop, and they are masters of propaganda, as you note. The good news is that most governments around the region well recognize what kind of entity that that we're dealing with. The publics are inflamed. There's no question. The publics are inflamed by images of mounting casualties, and that's an issue across the region. We are in a constant tempo of direct engagement discussions, public affairs efforts to really set the record straight. But it is quite a challenging environment for just the reasons you cite.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll be doing your best you can, but I think it's going to be more important as time goes on to up that game a little bit, because as this war goes on, that narrative is just going to grow and grow. Ms. Stroll, my next question is for you. The Biden administration recently presented testimony before this committee explicitly asking that Congress not include Iranian-backed proxies in a new authorized use of military force that we're considering. Since, as you noted in your opening statement, Iran-backed proxies in Iraq and Syria have launched at least 41 attacks on U.S. service members, while Hamas and Hezbollah continue to attack our friend and our ally Israel on a daily basis. Given the increased threat posed by Iranian-backed groups and proxies, has this administration's position on whether to include Iran-backed groups and proxies in a new AUMF changed?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. The position of this administration has not changed. Our self-defense strikes against Iran-backed militia groups have the underpinning of the President's Article 2 authority under the Constitution.
Okay. I guess that's a question for a later day. I would think that if we're going to include other groups, that maybe this would be one of the ones that we'd want to include as well, despite what you stated there, since they seem to be one of our biggest threats right now. But Secretary Stroll, this is my last question, given the chaos on the ground, the entrenchment of Hamas among the Palestinian people, and Hamas's history of misappropriating aid intended for civilian populations, what realistic and meaningful guardrails are being employed by the Biden administration to prevent Hamas from obtaining the food, the water, the medicine, and the other humanitarian aid that is intended for civilians?
I'd be happy to take that one, Congressman. So to date, we have not seen evidence that they have diverted that aid. It is something that is something that we are monitoring. There's obviously, it's quite a difficult security environment on the other side in Gaza, where aid goes in and where aid workers are working. But we are doing our best.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Gentleman yield.